Prison guards, what's the most disturbing thing you've dealt with? Story 1. A psychiatric patient, after being placed in an observation cell, pulled a razor out of his rectum and began to harm his own genitals. Another inmate in segregation would regularly eat his own feces. There were multiple violent fights and suicide attempts. One contractor fell 30 feet and his ankle was bent at a 90-degree angle to his leg. He refused an ambulance or any medical assistance, likely fearing a drug test. 2 co-workers helped him walk half a mile to the front gate. The worst incident by far was a segregation inmate slipping out of his cuffs, removing an officer's bean slot bar, a heavy chunk of iron with a prong on the end used to open cell door slots, and beating the officer to death with it. I was one of the first responders. I quit shortly after that incident. Story 2. I'm a former prison guard. I once had to escort a new prisoner to the medical unit. I didn't know why until we got there. He had bandages all over both legs and walked stiff-legged, unable to bend them. When he sat down, the nurse began removing the bandages, revealing rotted, abscessed flesh. He was a hero addict and had been injecting directly into his legs. His legs were so swollen and gangrenous that the smell almost knocked me out. When he tried to bend his right leg, the skin split and infection oozed all over the floor. The doctor looked at me and immediately called for another guard to replace me. I asked what was wrong and she said, "You're going into shock. You need to leave before you pass out." I was surprised, so I protested, but she insisted I go. On my way out, I started feeling lightheaded. I looked in a mirror and saw that my skin had gone sheet white. I'm usually a brown guy. I've seen people hanging, stabbed, and shot. I saw someone blow his head off with a shotgun. When I was in the Corps, I pulled burned bodies from a crashed CH-53E helicopter. But this was, by far, the worst thing I've ever seen. Story 3. I had a neighbor who worked as a corrections officer at a juvenile prison in my city. One day, a new kid arrived. He was very shy and quiet. Unfortunately, he was placed in a cell with one of the more violent inmates. On the second night, the violent inmate unscrewed a bolt from a bench and sat on his bed until the new kid fell asleep. When he woke up, the inmate said, "I'm gonna make you a pirate," and shoved the screw into the new kid's eye. My neighbor was the first CO to respond to the cries for help. When asked why he did it, the attacker said the new kid had looked at him the wrong way. It was a horrifying situation and not one I'd ever want to face under any circumstances. Story 4. This isn't my story, but a friend of mine works as a correctional officer at a jail. I asked him about the worst thing he'd seen after 6 months on the job. He told me about an elderly Asian man who barely spoke any English. One day, the man started slamming his head against the wall until he was bleeding, then demanded to be airlifted to a hospital in Atlanta. His injury wasn't too severe, so they treated him at the jail and placed him in a padded room to prevent further harm. Apparently, he wasn't satisfied. He took off his dentures and scraped at the wound on his head until he had exposed a 3-inch area of his skull. Needless to say, he got what he wanted. He was airlifted out after that. Story 5. Now, I wasn't a prison guard, but hear me out. I worked in the emergency mental health unit of my city's hospital for about 2 years. The patients I was responsible for were those placed on something called a form. Most were on a Form 1, which meant they had recently attempted to harm themselves, usually in a suicide attempt. These patients weren't allowed to leave the hospital and were essentially held there. If they tried to run straight for the exit, police would be called and they'd be arrested. So anyway, on with the story. One man came in. Imagine a biker-looking guy. Big beard, leather jacket, ripped jeans, big boots. He came into the hospital complaining about leg pain. A nurse examined him and then sent him over to me and placed him on a form. He told me he was just there because his leg hurt, which confused me. My first job in these cases is to get the patient to change into a hospital gown, collect their belongings, and lock them in a locker to be returned later. Patients can't have anything like strings or hard objects that could be used to harm themselves or others. He took off his jacket and I saw his arms. They were covered in what looked like paintball welts, raised bumps and bruises, scabbed over with dry blood. Then he took off his shirt and it was the same thing on his torso. There wasn't a single inch of skin without one of these welts. I asked him what happened and he said, "Oh, that's where the bugs come out." I asked if the doctor knew about this, and he said he'd told the nurse, and that's why he was sent here. He took off his jeans, and of course, it was the same all over his legs. When I took his jeans, I felt something heavy in the pocket, and pulled out a huge hunting knife. I immediately went to the doctor and told him. The doctor came over and I swear his jaw almost hit the floor. He closed the door and talked to the patient for about 20 minutes. When he came back out, he told me the patient believed bugs were crawling out of his skin, and he had been using the hunting knife to dig them out. Turns out he was a meth addict and also had a real bedbug infestation at his apartment. Story 6. I have 2 stories. One correctional officer friend of mine at a city lockup told me about an inmate everyone called the gingerbread man. He would strip naked and cover himself from head to toe in feces. He was trying to fake insanity, though his crimes were drug-related. He was badly beaten multiple times by the 3 to 5 inmates he shared a cell with. Eventually, he stopped and was later transferred to a regular prison. Another correctional officer I know told me about an inmate who had to be kept in solitary because he kept trying to infect people with HIV. He would fill plastic pen tubes with blood, try to stab people with them, and then blow into the tube. One night, when my friend wasn't on duty, the inmate broke a light fixture in the infirmary, used the shards to cut himself, and began threatening to infect anyone who entered. The officers locked the door and told him to wash up under the shower. He refused and eventually bled out hours later. Some of the officers received reprimands or disciplinary notes, but no one lost their job. The investigator understood why no one wanted to risk getting infected by a person actively bleeding and armed with long shards of broken glass. Story 7. Not me, but my uncle. He has been a prison guard for 10 years. He's seen countless things, but one event has always stuck in his mind. A little backstory. My uncle is a chill guy. He's the kind of person who would give inmates a few extra minutes on the phone to call their wife, provide some comfort when they were in a rough situation, like solitary confinement, and overall acted like a human being among humans. Naturally, this earned him respect from the inmates because he treated them like people. However, in his last year, he covered a shift for a colleague one night, and that's when everything went crazy. 5 inmates had very carefully planned a breakout that involved taking a hostage. Out of respect for my uncle, they specifically chose a day he wouldn't be there. But they had already set everything in motion, and once that happens, it's like a roller coaster. You can't stop at mid-descent. So he ended up being the one taken hostage. One of the inmates held a gun to his head and said, "You aren't supposed to be here. Why the hell are you here?" My uncle was shocked, understandably so, and the others tried to make a run for it. However, 2 of them, including the one with the gun, were shot in the knee. That's when the escape attempt ended. My uncle made it out alive, took 2 paid weeks off, and went on a healing vacation with his wife. In Story 8, I worked at a death row prison in Tennessee. We housed everyone from death row to ultra max to minimum security inmates. There was one inmate who stood out. He was always in and out of ultra max in the special needs facility down the road. There were 4 prisons within a 10-minute drive. I'll never forget him. We'll call him Inmate G. He constantly self-harmed and caused issues for both staff and inmates. One day we were extremely short-staffed, and I was assigned to the Ultra Max unit. I usually worked Unit 5, a medium security section, so I wasn't thrilled. We were rushing to get inmates showered, out to the yard and fed. All 1 tray at a time since only 1 pie flap could be opened per door. Inmate G was already banging and screaming because his food was taking too long. He decided to set a small fire. He created a stinger, basically a folded paperclip or notebook wire plugged into a socket, used to heat ramen noodles, and used it to ignite paper. In Ultra Max, if anything gets plugged into an outlet, that cell's power trips off. I rushed to put out the fire in front of his cell and filed a disciplinary report. The rest of the unit started banging and yelling too, mostly because Inmate G was disturbing everyone. Since I had the most experience, I got voluntold to handle it. Everyone else quieted down except for G. I radioed for another officer since 2 are required to handle an inmate in that unit. As I waited outside the door, ready to remove him for disciplinary review, Inmate G looked me dead in the eyes, took apart a pen, removed the spring, and began scraping at his wrists and neck. I called a medical code over the radio. Within 2 minutes, the emergency and medical staff arrived. During that short window, Inmate G took the pen spring and slowly inserted it into his urethra. There was blood everywhere. We eventually got him out and sent him to the special needs medical prison down the road. With him, stuff like that happened almost weekly. Story 9. I wasn't a guard. I was an inmate. This one guy came in for his first time in prison, not just jail. He decided to use the shower out of turn, which is a big deal due to unwritten rules. He was warned, and usually that's enough if you're new. But the next day, he did it again. He had just stepped in when Bear walked in behind him. I heard Bear say, "Boy, you was told." And then there was screaming and sobbing. A few minutes later, the new guy came running to the officer station, completely naked, with blood running down his legs, begging for help. The CO said, "Well, he did warn you." The new guy was taken to medical, and I never saw him again. I've got plenty more. Another time, before I was sentenced and still in county jail, I was on the bottom tier of a 2-tier block. The guy next to me was in for meth. We all had our own cells, but they were meant for 2 people. Eventually, he got a new cellmate. This guy was off. We call guys like him bugs. Apparently, he had an obsession with hygiene and hated bad smells. Unfortunately, the kid he moved in with didn't shower regularly and smelled bad. Around 3 a.m., I was woken up by the sound of a brutal beating. The new cellmate was slamming the kid's head on the ground while the kid begged for help. Then silence. I figured he got the message. I was wrong. About 45 minutes later, I heard the guy trying to wake him up. "Wake up, bro. Don't be a wimp. Just get up." Nothing. No response. Morning came, and during count, both inmates didn't come out. The CO walked up to the door, immediately radioed for backup, and vomited on the floor. 5 more officers rushed in, and they pulled the cellmate out. He was completely covered in blood. Not his own. The other kid was removed in a body bag. After the scene cleared, we resumed our day. I later found out the cell hadn't been cleaned yet, so I went to see it. I expected some blood, maybe a lot. I was wrong. The floor was dark red, the walls had bloody handprints, and the sheets were soaked. It looked like something out of the bathroom scene in Scarface. Absolutely horrific. I had only been in jail a month and thought that was the worst thing I'd ever see. I wish I had been right. That was nothing compared to what I would witness over the next few years. Story 10. I was going through my jail ops class after the academy and heard the backstory of a guy I had arrested a few times for shoplifting before I joined the academy. The guy had spent a large portion of his time in county jail inside the medical unit. The reason? He kept inserting razor blades into his urethra. He would break apart disposable razors, limited to 2 blades max, remove the blades, and insert them into himself. He did this repeatedly over days. There's only a limited number of razors inmates can purchase per week. By the end of one of these self-harming episodes, he'd have a large blood stain on the front of his pants, and deputies would have to physically restrain him just to get him medical attention. He'd be treated against his wishes, recover, and then do it all over again. When he couldn't get razors, he used broken plastic pieces from pens, paper, dried material, or anything else he could find to harm himself. Since no one stays in county jail forever, I still occasionally see him around town. Story 11. I had to do a maintenance job at the ADX Correctional Facility in Florence, Colorado. If you're unfamiliar, it's considered the highest security prison in the world. It houses people like the Boston bombers and other high-profile criminals. We were escorted by 3 prison guards throughout the facility. They told us not much really happens there, since all inmates are under such tight lockdown. However, the regular high-security prison next door, which we also walked through, was extremely tense. The guards didn't tell us everything, but they did share a few disturbing stories. They said that stabbings occurred roughly once a week, either involving guards or inmates. Every guard wore a stab vest, but they admitted the vest didn't offer much protection anymore, since inmates began aiming for the face and neck instead. Story 12. My wife works as a social worker at a juvenile detention center here in Brazil. Early on, she used to tell me about the young people she worked with, and 2 cases she shared still haunt me. The first was a child who had been kidnapped by a tribal group that was at war with some miners near the Amazon. They murdered his father in front of him and took him into the tribe. There, he was assaulted daily for about 6 months. He was only 6 or 7 years old. After he was rescued, he was never the same. By 8 or 9, he had turned to drugs, and by 10 or 11, he had entered prostitution to support his addiction. He ended up in detention after he and some friends robbed a car from a client who later died, although he wasn't directly involved in the death. My wife said he was very sweet and very effeminate. He was only 14 years old, and his story was beyond heartbreaking. Sadly, even inside the detention center, he continued to experience abuse. Story 13. I'm not a guard, but my friend used to be. He eventually quit. It just became too much. He worked in a high-security prison that housed the worst of the worst, murderers, rapists, and others with horrific charges. He told me many stories, but the one that stuck with me was about an inmate imprisoned for child abuse. One day, this inmate began asking for medical attention. The guards kept asking him what was wrong, but he wouldn't explain. Since he gave no reason, they kept denying the request. He continued to ask until he became visibly desperate. Eventually, the guards checked on him and found him curled up on his bed. When they lifted the blanket, they saw blood everywhere. He had been assaulted by others using some kind of object, and they had attempted to mutilate him. My friend also said something I never forgot, that sexual activity among male inmates isn't even considered gay within that environment. It's something else entirely. Story 14. My dad was a CO at the ARDC on Rikers Island. Though this might be the least graphic or disturbing story in this thread, it honestly reads like something out of a 90s sitcom. My father had worked in the Adolescent Remand Detention Center for a couple of years, but one day he had to cover for the security officer. That job primarily involves transporting inmates from their cells to security hearings and carrying out any disciplinary action, like taking them to solitary. My dad arrived for his shift early in the morning, grabbed his usual cup of coffee, and checked the list of inmates he had to transport. Ah, a nice and easy one, he thought as he read the first name on the list. Let's call him Carlos. He knew Carlos from the kitchen, where Carlos cleaned and occasionally served food. Neither my dad nor any of the other COs had ever heard of Carlos being involved in anything violent, and no one seemed to have a problem with him. Caffeine in hand and a little pep in his step, my dad walked up to Carlos's cell. Carlos greeted him with a half-hearted smile. My dad said good morning and walked him over to the security hearing room. Carlos sat across the table from the board members who were going to review his case, and my dad settled into a corner seat, savoring the rare chance to relax and enjoy his coffee before the workday ramped up. Fast forward a few minutes into the meeting, Weiner discovered on security tapes that at 0500 hours on Wednesday the 5th, inmate number 1079 washed his dirty shoes in the coffee maker and then went on to make coffee for the day. Upon further questioning, the inmate admitted to having washed his shoes in the coffee maker on a daily basis for the past several months. Cue the most epic spit take of my father's life. Needless to say, Carlos' reputation didn't survive that day. Story 15. I've told these stories before in other threads, so I'll just paste them here. I used to be a CO at a supermax prison in Nebraska. Several events stand out to me, some involving inmates, others not. There was one individual in for child-related offenses who received both a Boy Scouts magazine and Playboy. He would cut out the boys' faces from the Boy Scouts magazine and paste them onto the bodies of the women in Playboy, then hang them on his wall. We also overheard a self-identified Satanist praying for one of the COs to get cancer. In the SMU, Special Management Unit, where violent, unstable, or disciplinary problem inmates were held, you often had bodily fluids thrown at you. Semen, spit, urine, and worse. There was one inmate whose rectum prolapsed after he tried to smuggle a Pringles can-sized tube full of contraband. I didn't witness it, just heard the story, so some details may be exaggerated. There were also paranormal occurrences. The prison had many yards, fenced-in areas with concrete floors and basketball hoops attached to the galleries and separate from the main yard. Lockdown was at 8:15, with head count at 9 p.m. After that, no one was allowed out of their cells until 4 a.m., when workers were released to the kitchen. During my first night shift, I was in the control center when the computer pinged. Someone had pressed the intercom button on the mini-yard. That button is used by inmates to request to come back inside, but no one had been let out there. To get in from the outside, someone would have to bypass 3 layers of razor wire. I pulled up the camera feed, nothing. I figured it was a glitch and cleared the alert. The system immediately pinged again. Still nothing on camera. The speaker next to the intercom lets us talk to whoever is outside, so I selected it and asked who was there. No reply. I called my lieutenant to report the issue. His response? Yeah, that happens. Just open the intercom and tell him the mini-yard is closed. Then he hung up. So I did what he said. I opened the intercom and said, sorry, the mini-yard is closed, using the same tone I would during the day shift. Immediately, the ringing stopped. Then there was the one that really freaked me out. A co-worker was watching the video monitors around 9 p.m. when he saw something moving in a nearby cornfield. He panned the camera and zoomed in. It was a large black dog-like creature. No big deal, right? Just some animal. But as he was about to pan the camera away, the thing stood up on two legs and sprinted across the field toward the tree line. I didn't believe him at first, but the camera system stores footage for 30 days. I got to see it for myself during training. Absolutely chilling. Story 16. CO here. The very worst part about this job is how eventually nothing phases you anymore. My family always asked for stories from the jail, but I can never come up with any, because nothing is shocking to me anymore. Like the man who tried to take his own life by cutting his wrists, creating a pool of blood in the bottom of his cell. It's shocking how much blood a person can lose and still put up a fight against the people trying to save him. Or the individual who repeatedly inserted pencils into himself. He was kept in permanent psychiatric protective custody because whenever he was in general population, he would do it again. Insert a pencil, leave it for days, and end up in the medical unit. While in psychiatric segregation, he wasn't allowed any items in his cell, except paper to write his attorney. And what do you need for paper? That's right, his favorite item, a pencil. Every time he asked for one, we sighed, knowing what he was going to do with it. Or the time someone asked to use the bathroom while in the recreation yard. There isn't a bathroom in rec, so he was told to wait. 10 minutes later, he walked up to me holding a glove full of urine. I'm incredibly lucky he didn't throw it at me. None of these things are shocking to me anymore. Story 17. Hazing is a big thing in Texas. New officers always get picked on. I was a newer officer assigned to administrative segregation, a part of the prison where inmates are locked in their cells 23 hours a day. So naturally, the hazing was directed at me. On one particular day, I was in the control picket, which controls all the cell doors, and I kept hearing a strange noise. "Oh, where?" followed by a repeated thud. It was the weirdest sound. I looked at my coworkers, but they didn't seem alarmed. I asked, "Guys, what the hell is that?" One of them said, "Dude, that guy might be having a stroke or something. Go check on him." I panicked a bit and rushed over to make sure the inmate was okay. Big mistake. There was a man in his cell, one leg hiked up on a metal shelf, using a plastic spoon in an inappropriate way, while also engaging in very disturbing behavior involving a strip of his mattress tied tightly around himself and hitting the metal shelf. The ooey sound was him moaning, and the thud sound was him striking the shelf. He was absolutely harming himself in a disturbing way. I'd never seen anything like it. My co-workers knew about it. They thought it would be funny to send me in as a joke, since this guy did it regularly. From then on, whenever I heard that same sound, I knew to stay away from that cell. Worst part? About a year later, I did the same thing to another rookie. 6 months later, we had an institutional shakedown. Every cell is searched. This guy's cell was on the list. No strange noises that day, which was a relief. I passed by and noticed a foul smell. I removed him and locked him elsewhere. When I searched his cell, I found his sink filled with disgusting, rotten liquid. Right next to it was the same plastic spoon. Turns out every meal he was served, since he was in segregation and meals are brought to the cell, he dumped into the sink, filled it with water, and let it ferment. That's what he was eating, rotten soup, and he used the same spoon for everything. If people are interested, I've got more where that came from. Story 18. My best friend is a correctional officer. He's told me a lot of wild things, literally a lot involving bodily fluids, but this one I found hysterical. There's an inmate they call Dirty Dan, who's obsessed with unsanitary behavior and putting things where they don't belong. They regularly have to pull him out of his cell in what my friend calls full teapot mode, nearly elbow deep in himself. One day my buddy was about to finish his shift. He was escorting another inmate down the hallway when suddenly the janitor's closet, which should have been locked, burst open. Out comes Dirty Dan, apparently riding in a mop bucket. He had the squeezy handle of the bucket inserted where it absolutely shouldn't be, his feet in the bucket, and he was using the mop as both a balance and an oar to row himself down the hallway while shouting nonsense. According to my friend, he just had a not dealing with this today moment. He turned around, walked the inmate he was escorting back to his cell, and left someone else to handle it. Personally, I thought the whole thing was hilarious. Story 19. I wasn't a prison guard, but I worked as a jail deputy sheriff in California for about 2.5 years. I definitely have some disturbing stories, but the most unsettling part of the job was realizing how normal some of the worst offenders seem. One inmate stood out. He was polite, well-spoken, always said please and thank you. Based on his demeanor, I assumed he was in for something minor. That changed during his video arraignment, when he tried to confess to multiple counts of child-related offenses, around 15 charges, all involving his own daughter and one of her friends. There were no obvious red flags, no creepy vibe, nothing that would make you guess what he'd done. That really stuck with me. Some people do look the part, sure, but others, the worst ones, can appear completely normal. It's chilling. Story 20. I'm a correctional officer, now a lieutenant, with just over 4 years of experience. At this point, nothing surprises me anymore. I think a lot of us get that way. We become numb from daily exposure to a world that functions nothing like the one outside these walls. I'll share a few stories. One time I was strip searching an inmate being placed in lockup for engaging in inappropriate behavior with others. When he removed his underwear, I saw that he had attempted some sort of self-performed gender reassignment surgery. It had all healed over, but it was an absolute mess. I felt the blood rush from my head and started to feel queasy, but I still had to follow protocol. That included asking him to turn, squat, and cough. The way he looked at me as he complied, it was unsettling, like it was meant to be disturbing. Another time, while placing leg irons on an inmate, I smelled what I thought was just a bad fart. I sarcastically thanked him for crop dusting me, but as I lifted his pant leg to attach the restraint device, a turd dropped directly onto my hand. It took me a full second to process what had just happened. The drug use inside is constant. I've seen people with needles still hanging from their arms, completely out of their minds on substances like K2 or spice. One time, I walked into a unit and caught someone smoking it. As soon as he saw me, he began seizing and collapsed. His head hit the concrete floor hard. That sound, the dull crack followed by blood and vomit, still gives me chills when I remember it. A few months ago, one of my close friends at another facility took his own life, a self-inflicted gunshot. He always seemed happy, probably a coping mechanism. I had no idea he was suffering. I wish I could have been there for him. Just a couple days ago, one of my own officers died on the job. I wasn't on shift, but his partner tried to revive him for 15 minutes until EMTs arrived. We're all still trying to process it. Running a facility while grieving someone who should still be walking through the door is surreal. He used to constantly mess with me, pranks, jokes, all of it. I loved it. I hated it. And now I almost expect him to pop back into central control and call me something offensive just to make me laugh again. He was my brother. Story 21. I used to work as an EMT before the job became too stressful. I responded often to the local women's high-security prison. It was always strange getting patients who seemed like perfectly normal people, only to look them up afterward and learn the violent nature of the crimes they'd committed: murder, kidnapping, arson, and more. But the worst thing I've ever seen wasn't something committed by an inmate. We got a call for a cardiac arrest, code Charlie, which means urgent response. Our unit was located less than 5 minutes from the prison, so myself, the EMT, the driver, and one crew member responded immediately. There's a lot of protocol involved when entering a prison. Your ambulance gets searched, IDs are checked, and you have to go through multiple gates. Given the emergency, we asked the staff to help us get through more quickly. The guards didn't seem to care or even acknowledge us. I get it, it's their job, but when someone's life is on the line, bending the rules a little can save a life. To keep it short, it took us 40 minutes to reach the patient. We were given the wrong floor, and there was an overall sense of indifference. The woman had been unresponsive for over 30 minutes by the time we got to her. I knew right away her chances were low. What angers me to this day is that she might have been saved if we'd gotten there earlier. When we arrived, the guards had already attempted CPR, but the AED leads were placed incorrectly, and they hadn't shaved her chest. It feels odd saying this, but she was very hairy. And while you might not expect that, especially with women, shaving is absolutely necessary for AED pads to work properly. It was one of the experiences that made me leave the profession. That and the fact that people flipping burgers at McDonald's were making more than I was. Story 22. I worked at a prison for women in the mental health department, where Suicide Watch was common. If an inmate threatened self-harm, they'd be placed on SUIC watch. That involved a full strip search, putting them in a safety gown, and placing them in a special observation cell. Often it was used as a way to get attention, but sometimes it was very real. One morning, shortly before my shift, a woman was placed on watch. My desk was located right by the cell. Later that morning, when I returned to my station, she was being restrained per guidelines because she had hidden a razor blade in her mouth and began cutting herself. The strip search includes a mouth inspection, but she had cleverly created a small pocket in her inner cheek and inserted the blade, allowing the area to heal over it. She essentially made a flesh sheath inside her mouth for the blade. It was also common for inmates to hide razors in the rectum. Thankfully, most of the time, they kept a protective cap on. Story 23. I worked in county corrections for 10 years and saw some truly disturbing things. A few stuck with me over the years. One involved a mentally ill man who had just been brought in. He was saying bizarre things, so the sergeant ordered us to strip him down and place him in the padded cell to prevent self-harm. A couple hours later, the combination of his mental state and whatever substances he'd used started to push him into a violent episode. He suddenly became convinced he had diamonds embedded inside him, specifically in his colon. He believed that if he could remove them, he could bribe us for his freedom. Slowly but surely, he began inserting his hand into himself, trying to retrieve the diamonds. We were on night shift and short-staffed. We had to call street deputies for backup, which was at least 30 minutes away. Before they arrived, the man managed to get his entire fist into his body, nearly up to his forearm. Then he yanked his hand out, and with it came a torrent of blood and waste. He repeated this multiple times, each time pulling out more blood and material. By the time backup arrived and suited up in protective gear, the man went for one final pull. This time, he pulled out a large piece of tissue and part of his intestines. There was now a pile of his insides on the floor, connected back into his body. We entered the cell and had to restrain him while he fought us, fully covered in his own fluids. He was still actively bleeding. EMS came in, sedated him, and placed his organs into a bucket. He was put on a gurney and rushed to the hospital. Miraculously, he survived and was transferred to the state hospital's mental health unit. I also witnessed a man take the life of his cellmate and consume part of the body. I have more stories, but that one still haunts me the most. Story 24. I wasn't a corrections officer, but I was an inmate at what they call Gladiator School here in Florida. It's a facility for inmates under 24 years old with sentences under 20 years. They call it Gladiator School because if you don't know how to fight going in, you definitely will learn. Fights happen constantly, so often that the sound of fists hitting faces becomes as normal as birds chirping outside. Where it got truly intense was with the gang activity. Attacks would be scheduled so that multiple assaults happened simultaneously in different dorms. I once saw someone get stabbed in the neck with a 6-inch homemade weapon right in front of me. Getting hit with padlocks inside socks or tied to belts? That happened at least once a week. Some of the weapons people made were unbelievable. I saw inmates with pieces of rebar, lawnmower blades. One guy had something that looked like a sword. Even fence ties were turned into weapons. It was terrifying what people could create inside those walls. Story 25. My father used to be a prison guard years ago when I was a kid. By years ago, I mean about 17 years back. He's religious and doesn't fully understand LGBTQ+ people, but he believes they deserve human rights and fair treatment. He always told me one story that stuck with him. There was an inmate who wanted to transition and become female. While in prison, the inmate took extreme action. He mutilated himself and flushed the severed part down the toilet. Since prison toilets have disposal mechanisms, there was no way to retrieve it. My dad had to hold pressure on the man's injury while waiting for medical help. He used a towel, but he described it as an overwhelming situation due to how much blood there was. Paramedics arrived shortly after. My dad never told me whether the man survived, and honestly, I didn't want to know. Just hearing about it makes me uncomfortable to this day. Story 26. I'm a former prison guard from a private juvenile detention center. The most disturbing thing I witnessed didn't come from the inmates. It came from the facility itself. The kids were barely being fed. Dinner was often just a single slice of bologna, half a slice of bread, a jelly packet, and half an orange. Of course, whenever there was an inspection or family visitation, the food magically improved. I always wondered how they got away with such mistreatment until I found out. I was working the night shift and in charge of the master control room, which meant I had keys to most of the facility. I decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs. On my route, I passed by the nursing office. I'd never really paid attention to it before, but I noticed one of those old-fashioned doctor's office scales inside. Out of curiosity, I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and weighed myself. The scale read 212 pounds, which was strange because I weighed in the high 170s at the time. That's when it hit me. The facility had rigged the scales. They were underfeeding the kids to save money after underbidding for the prison contract and faking their weights to avoid detection during inspections. Story 27. This isn't about me, but my stepfather, who just retired after working in a prison for many years. His favorite story to tell when people ask what kind of attitude or mindset you need to have for the job is one from when he was just starting out. He was going into a room where multiple inmates were gathered, looking for a specific inmate he needed to escort to medical. As he stepped in, a large, intimidating inmate, he describes him as a Bubba type, and 3 of his friends surrounded him. The large inmate looked at him and said, "What would you do if we held you down and I got up in you?" A clear threat of sual violence. My stepfather said that inside he was terrified, but he didn't show it. He stood tall, looked the inmate in the eye, and calmly replied, "One of us will die trying." The inmate took a step back, and another guard who had been outside the gate started yelling at the group to back off. After that moment, he never had any problems with intimidating inmates again. He always said that in his prison, as long as you didn't treat the inmates like trash, they wouldn't disrespect you. But if something did happen, you had to stand your ground, or else they'd know you were vulnerable. He also mentioned, although reluctantly, that there were quite a few guards, both male and female, who had inappropriate relationships with inmates. But he didn't like talking about former co-workers, so he'd leave it at that. Story 28. Here's one that stuck with me. It's not my own experience, but it came from a campus security guard I knew back when I lived in university housing. She told me she used to work at a British prison. One day, a young new officer joined the staff and ended up angering one of the massive, muscular inmates. The inmate held a grudge, and when he caught the young officer alone, he shoved him to the ground and stomped on his head multiple times before anyone could intervene. The woman I knew was one of the first responders to the scene. She described it as horrifying. There was blood and brain matter on the floor, pieces of skull stuck to the walls. The young officer was still alive, but his head was nearly destroyed. He survived the attack but was left in a permanent vegetative state. Hearing her describe it made me feel physically sick. Not all prisoners were like that, she said, but it was something she could never forget. On a related note, she also worked at the prison where Reggie Cray was held, one of London's most infamous gangsters. She told me he was always polite and respectful to her because she treated him like a person. In fact, he looked out for her. One time, another inmate told her he planned to hurt her when he got the chance. Reggie Cray apparently heard about it and told the man to back off. The next day, that same inmate was found beaten nearly to death in the showers. She once asked Reggie if he had something to do with it, and he just gave her a wink and said, "Nah, I wouldn't do something like that." These were the kinds of stories she'd share with me during her night shifts, when we'd step outside for a cigarette together. They've stayed with me ever since. Story 29. Up until recently, I would have said the most disturbing parts of this job were responding to suicide attempts, people cutting themselves, or dealing with individuals who've taken the lives of others, including law enforcement officers, and seem to think it's funny. I've seen people smear feces on themselves, witnessed hangings, broken bones, brutal assaults, and even death. These things are hard in the moment, but for the most part, they've never left a lasting mark on me. But now I'd say being physically assaulted is the most disturbing thing I've experienced. It happened last week. I was in a confined space conducting a search when someone grabbed me by the neck and slammed me into the wall before I could react. Since then, I've been having nightmares and can't shake it. The other incidents I could mentally distance myself from since they weren't happening to me directly. But this one hit differently. It really makes me question everything, especially whether the $15 an hour is worth the constant risk and trauma we face every single day. Story 30. It's disturbing when you realize the kind, polite, elderly man you've chatted with is serving a life sentence for assaulting children during his time as a priest. Or when you laugh along with someone, only to later learn he was convicted for harming his own grandchild in the most horrific way imaginable. I've had conversations with someone who, along with his son, harmed his granddaughter and then used chemicals to try and cover up what they did. These were not stories from newspapers. These were people I interacted with daily. I'm not a parent, but I have a very young brother, and it was incredibly difficult treating individuals like that as normal. It was disturbing to know that people capable of such acts could carry themselves like they'd done nothing wrong. That goes for many of the men I encountered. One inmate murdered 3 people in a fast food restaurant because they were being too loud. He was charming and funny, just a guy you wouldn't expect that from. When I once asked him why he did it, he just shrugged and laughed. I tried not to learn what they were in for. I was afraid it would change how I treated them. It's hard to be kind when you know someone has done something unspeakable. At the same time, I reminded myself that no sane person could do things like that to their own family or to children. I always wondered if, deep down, they hated themselves, or if it truly didn't affect them at all. Story 31. I've got a few stories. I used to work at the Estelle unit for TDCJ. It's one of 3 supermax prisons in Texas, 2 under TDCJ, and 1 under the BOP. In the supermax area, specifically the expansion block, known as HS, high security, there's a section called H-Wing, known by many staff as the Hell Wing. That's where Texas houses some of its most dangerous inmates. These individuals even have their own binder with detailed histories, something no other inmates have. One inmate had committed violent acts while in custody, including an assault on 2 nurses at a Free World hospital. Another would recount crimes involving children in horrifying detail. I often talk about the reality of these situations to show how dark things can get. But here's a story from the General Population Wing, known as the Main Building or MB. There's a transient section called D1, where inmates are temporarily housed, usually for medical reasons, as the facility also serves as a regional medical unit. One of the inmates there had clear mental health issues. He would constantly talk to himself, usually nonsensical phrases. Most staff didn't pay much attention to him. One night, while I was working in another area, I got a call over the radio. Flash, flash, flash. Offender in need of emergency medical care. That's how ICS is initiated, usually signaling a serious incident, often a fight or severe injury. This time it was a homicide, or very close to one. We found an inmate face down in his bunk, tied up with bed sheets, blood everywhere. He was shirtless and disturbing symbols had been carved into his back. The attacker was curled up on the floor mumbling, "Demons, demons." The victim was barely alive and sent out via 911. He later died at the hospital. No one could get a clear motive from the suspect. A neighboring inmate said he heard the whole thing, the screams, the rambling, and the attacker talking about demons. It felt like something straight out of True Detective. Story 32. I worked in a juvenile detention center for a few days. One of the kids ran away, so while some of the staff went to search the grounds, they left me alone in a room with about 8 kids to keep watch and make sure no one else tried to run. I was immediately pushed up against the wall by one of the girls. I'm about 5 feet 3 inches and maybe 100 pounds. This girl was probably 5 feet 9 inches and around 225 pounds. She held me there with her forearm pressed against my neck, threatening to stab me with her pen. The other kids laughed and screamed like it was a game. It felt like I had been dropped into a madhouse. They completely trashed the room, throwing papers everywhere, flipping a tall metal garbage can and slamming it against the wall, and jumping from one desk to another. One kid defecated and smeared it all over the wall, then tried to throw some at me while the others laughed hysterically. Eventually, a guard came in and helped me, but he seemed so unfazed, like this was completely normal. He just cleared the kids out and casually told me to clean up the room, including the mess on the wall. That was my last day. I had genuinely hoped I could make a difference in these kids' lives, but after that, I realized I wasn't cut out for it. Story 33. I worked in prisons, but as a civilian, not a guard. My role required me to work all over the facility, unlike many civilian staff who only stayed in specific areas. I saw more than my fair share of disturbing things. One of the most intense moments happened in the prison gym, which was in a separate building. I was there while a group of inmates were working out, probably meeting with someone. A fight suddenly broke out between 2 younger inmates. One got the upper hand and pinned the other to the floor. Then several others rushed in to join the beating. I noticed a prisoner on the far side of the gym, near the dumbbells. He picked one up, maybe around 45 pounds, and calmly walked over. Without hesitation, he dropped it on the guy's head. It landed on his jaw. In my memory, his face just shattered. I later learned his jaw was broken in 7 places. They had to send him to an outside hospital for surgery and rehab. He never returned during my time there. Another time, I visited the cell of a man with severe mental health issues. He had carved disturbing messages into the walls and written in what appeared to be his own blood. The walls and floor were completely covered. It looked like a scene from Seven. I also spent some time at a women's facility. They had to modify all broom handles to be double-ended to prevent them from being used inappropriately. The amount of things I saw will stay with me forever. Story 34. I've been working as a correctional officer in a maximum security facility for just over 8.5 years. I've witnessed gang assaults, multiple slashings, and the aftermath of SEAL violence, but the worst thing I've ever seen still haunts me today. To explain, here's how our evening routine works. We serve dinner around 4:10 p.m., escort inmates back to their units, and conduct a facility-wide head count. I'm responsible for overseeing the second mess hall during mealtimes. After dinner, I was counting the plastic utensils when my radio came alive. It was my area sergeant, and I could tell by his voice that something was wrong. He asked if I'd seen a specific inmate during the meal. I knew the inmate well, but realized I hadn't seen him that day. My sergeant said he was missing. I grabbed my keys and rushed to search the industry building where the inmate worked. As I entered the building, I was hit by the overwhelming smell of blood, like copper in the air. 2 other officers joined me. As we turned the corner, we saw a pool of blood covering the floor and a motionless figure lying shirtless in one of the trough sinks. The sound of clanking pipes and overflowing hot water filled the room. We called for medical support and an ambulance. Just then, the man sat up. He had cut his wrist down to the bone. He looked at us and said, "You guys are about to see some weird stuff." That's when we saw his other hand digging into his abdomen. He was attempting to pull out his own intestines. We calmly told him help was on the way and asked who had hurt him. He simply said, "I did this to myself. I have to get the orb out." One of the officers finally found the light switch, and the full extent of the scene came into view. Blood everywhere, handprints, smears, and a flood of bloodied water. He had even stabbed himself in the neck. We stopped him from removing more of his insides, unclogged the drain, and recovered the scrap metal he had used. We wrapped him in blankets to keep everything in place until the gurney arrived. Soon we heard the helicopter landing nearby. Thanks to our response, he survived. But it's something I'll never forget. That level of trauma stays with you, and I hope I never witness anything like it again. Story 35. I'm not a corrections officer, but my dad was. One of his most memorable stories was about an inmate they nicknamed Count Wacky. He earned the name because he would convert anything into a makeshift cape and was known for being completely unpredictable. Count Wacky had a disturbing habit of hoarding his own bodily waste, and anyone else's he could get, and then barricading himself inside his cell to spray it out of the door at whoever walked by. He did it so often that staff became desensitized to it. They'd even label splash zones and just avoid the area until he got tired of the game. One day, an inmate cornered my dad and said, "We're all sick of Wacky's behavior, man. What's it going to take for you guys to shut that down?" Just as he finished saying that, something bounced off the guy's shoulder and landed between his and my dad's shoes. It was Count Wacky's severed genitals. Apparently, no one had taken his complaint seriously, so he used floss to injure himself and then tossed the result out into the housing unit. My dad looked at the inmate, then down at the floor and calmly said, "Yeah, I think this is enough right here." He bagged the remains for evidence and possible medical reconstruction. I keep telling my dad he should write a book. Story 36. I'm not a guard, but my father was incarcerated in California during the 1980s, and he told me about a situation that was both intense and disturbingly humorous. He was part of a Southern gang while inside. Despite not being Latino, they accepted him, and he did work for them. California prisons have enough of a Latino population to support 2 distinct groups, the Sureños and the Norteños. Periodically, new inmates would arrive by bus, and they'd be sorted by affiliation. One time, the Sureños were assigned a mouthy 18-year-old who was far too confident for his own good. Within a week, the group got a warning from another gang. Either shut him up or someone else would. Since the kid wouldn't stop being disruptive, my dad and 6 other men cornered him outside of his cell and beat him until he lost consciousness. Afterward, one of the ringleaders told my dad to pull down his pants. Nervously, he did, and instead of what he feared, they pulled out packets of mayonnaise from the cafeteria. They opened the kid's pants, stomped on him from behind, and squeezed mayonnaise down his back. The kid woke up confused and terrified, thinking something far worse had happened. He never learned the truth, but he did learn to keep quiet. Cruel as it was, it probably saved his life. Story 37. I ran a juvenile offender program for a short time after finishing my master's degree. Part of our therapeutic model included a farm program where boys cared for animals and garden. It was meant to teach responsibility and provide calm structure. Supervision was supposed to be one-to-one at all times. One day I was 3 miles away when a mayday call came over the radio. I rushed over in a van. 2 staff had called out, and the remaining 3 weren't equipped to manage behavior. They were more idealistic than practical. That day, the kids were given hatchets to break up frozen soil in the garden. One particularly aggressive boy, who should never have been unsupervised, used the hatchet on another student's head. His stated reason? Because he was a baby offender, the attacker had his own troubling history. I had to restrain the attacker for over an hour until medics airlifted the injured boy, who thankfully made a full recovery. He's now working as a prep cook. His attacker, however, signed himself out at 18 and went on a serious crime spree. He's now in federal prison. Another time, a 6'4", 300-pound teen with autism escaped through a window and ran toward the highway. I called for backup, but he reached a logging truck and tried to detach the trailers, hoping to cause a catastrophic accident. I tackled him just in time. We rolled down a hill and I managed to hold him down until state police arrived. I'm 5 feet 9 inches and female. I used to play rugby in college, but I definitely didn't have the strength to hold that kid alone. It felt like one of those stories where people lift cars in moments of crisis. The whole incident was caught on camera. I showed the footage to our executive director and board, asking for more staff and a raise. I was making $32,000 a year. They refused both. So I walked. I took the video with me and reported everything. The center was shut down within a week, and I received a small settlement from the state. That teen is now in a rural program with 4 full-time staff assigned to him. He's in his mid-20s now with a long history of behavioral issues. I left the profession after that. It made teaching in a tough public school system feel like a walk in the park. Running an outdoor mentoring nonprofit afterward felt like the most peaceful job in the world by comparison. Story 38. My dad is a retired warden from a maximum security prison, and my brother currently works there. I've toured the facility before and once worked on a video project there, but the two of them have the real stories. A prison transport van was driving inmates on the highway when it hit a truck head-on at full speed. My dad responded to the scene. The driver, another guard, and most of the inmates were killed instantly. The inmates weren't wearing seatbelts, and the ones sitting near the front were crushed through the steel grating that separates the rear from the front seats. It was horrific. One time a radio call came in asking my dad, then a shift supervisor, to respond to a specific cell. When he arrived, he saw an inmate calmly sitting on his bed, eating an apple. My dad asked him to come to the window. The inmate took another bite, stood up, and walked over. When my dad asked what was going on, the inmate tilted his chin up, and a huge gash opened up across his throat. He had used a piece of a broken razor to cut his neck wide open while sitting on his bed. The wound was so clean that the facility doctor later said he'd never seen anything like it, not even in surgery. The man had sliced all the way down to the muscle, but somehow avoided major arteries or critical damage. One of the more bizarre but almost funny stories. Back when pool tables were allowed in the housing units, long since removed for safety reasons, my dad witnessed something unforgettable. The housing mods radiate out from a central control area with full glass walls for visibility. Standing in the hallway, he saw an inmate walk up to the pool table, drop a pool ball into a sock, and swing it at another inmate. But as he swung, the sock ripped, and the ball flew against the wall. The empty sock gently hit the intended target, who turned around and immediately retaliated, beating the attacker senseless before the officers could intervene. Story 39. I worked as a correctional officer for about a year when I was 19. It was at my state's maximum security facility, which also housed the only holding unit for mentally ill inmates. I have a couple of stories that stuck with me. One evening, While working in the control room, I received a call from a cell. I turned on the light to see what was going on. The inmate at the window held up a bloody hand, and in it was one of his own testicles. I immediately called for backup and notified medical. He had apparently smuggled in a shower razor and had mutilated himself. He flushed everything before the officers could get into the cell. I later heard from someone still working there that about a year later, he completed the process and removed the rest of his genitalia. Another time involved an inmate classified as full shackle and double escort. That meant wrist and ankle restraints, connected through a belt chain, escorted by 2 officers at all times. Regulations required us to give him outdoor time every few days. On this particular day, after his hour alone in the yard cage, we went to escort him back and noticed a bulge in his cheek. We asked what he had, and he turned and said, "I've got a dip in." The smell hit us immediately. It was awful. He had relieved himself in the cage and had stuffed it into his mouth, pretending it was chewing tobacco. The final story isn't as disturbing, but was very surreal. I was assigned to armed ambulance escort duty for an inmate claiming chest pains. On the ride to the hospital, he went into cardiac arrest. It was an intense moment. On one hand, I was responsible for using deadly force if he tried to escape, but now I was helping the medics try to save his life. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. It was one of those moments that made me realize just how unpredictable this job could be. That's about all I've got from my year in max custody. Story 40. I was an inmate in county jail and witnessed something that still haunts me. I believe I saw 4 correctional officers seriously harm, or possibly kill, an elderly man. It happened while I was in a holding cell in intake with around 50 other people. Officers brought in a man who looked to be at least 85 years old, maybe older. He was extremely intoxicated, couldn't stand on his own, and was slurring badly, barely coherent. Despite that, he was mouthing off at the officers, talking loudly and aggressively. They walked him past all of us and, without hesitation, struck him in the knees with their batons. He collapsed, and they dragged him into a side room, closing the door behind them. We could all hear the sounds, the rapid metallic pings of batons hitting something. We could hear the old man screaming. Then suddenly the screaming stopped. A moment later the door flew open, and we saw him on the ground. He was seizing, convulsing uncontrollably, bouncing off the floor. The officers began shouting for medical assistance. After about 5 to 10 minutes, they dragged him out on a sheet. He was unconscious, or worse, completely covered in blood and waste. As they dragged him past us, one of the officers stopped and said, "Anyone else want to talk to a CO like that? You'll get the same." The man was white, but what shocked me more was how it affected the entire holding cell. Even the Black and Latino inmates, many of whom made it clear they didn't like white people, were visibly disturbed. No one laughed, no one cheered. The violence brought us together in a strange and sad way. For the next 6 hours, no one used racial slurs. We sat quietly, talking to each other like human beings, regardless of background. It was humbling, in the worst possible way. Story 41. I've been a correctional officer for about 6 months now. One of the more memorable experiences happened while I was assigned to work in the infirmary. Parole violators are held in the infirmary until they're medically cleared for general population. One inmate in particular was detoxing from a mix of substances. He was restless and agitated throughout the day. Toward the end of my shift, a nurse decided to administer a sedative, partly to ease his symptoms and partly because it's hard to scream in pain while asleep. The inmate had open sores all over his body. Due to his unstable behavior and the risk of blood-borne illness, the protocol required that we enter his cell to assist with the injection. He was handcuffed and seated as the nurse explained what the medication was and what he could expect from it. As they prepared him for the shot, he began recounting how he got his wounds. He said he had been mixing reactive chemicals for illegal purposes, but didn't want to provide too many details. Apparently, the bottle exploded while he was working, and he had to run out of the house to avoid the risk of fire. Later, it became clear he was likely manufacturing meth in his shower. The chemical explosion caused burns and chemical injuries across his body. Given the locations of the burns, it was clear he was already undressed when the accident happened.